This is News in No Time. Ed Gordon on today's roundtable. The NAACP wants to block the New Orleans election. And is the United States headed for a dictator in the White House? Joining us to discuss these topics and more from our NPR headquarters in Washington, D.C., economist and author Julianne Malveaux. She's the president and CEO of Last Word Productions. And with me here in the New York Bureau, Michael Myers, executive director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition, and Walter Fields, CEO and publisher of the NorthstarNetwork.com. And Julianne, you should note that you're doing well by being in Washington, D.C., because you have three very sick black men in one little small room here. So
y'all keep that to yourselves, okay?
Be glad you are where you are. Let's get into this because, Walter, we were talking off mic just a few moments ago. Here's a statement that we were surprised did not get much play in the press. Sandra Day O'Connor speaking at Georgetown University, and we note that she retired after 24 months on the bench, suggests that the United States is in danger of edging toward dictatorship if the parties, this is the Republican parties, right-wingers, continue to attack the judiciary. She really believes that we are setting the climate for violence against judges, and this is a quote from her. It takes a lot of denigration before a country falls into dictatorship, but we should avoid these ends by avoiding these beginnings.
It was a profound statement, and when it comes from a former justice of the United States Supreme Court, I think the nation should take notice. I mean, the fact that she would, number one, be that explicit in a speech, which very rarely the Supreme Court justices veer into the political. But she laid it all on the line. Even in their retirement. Even in their retirement. I mean, they really do sort of walk the line. But for Sandra Day O'Connor to make this statement, particularly a statement that was without a doubt targeted towards the Republican Party and the conservative flank of the Republican Party, I think was incredible. And the fact that, the conservatives have always talked about the liberal bench, the fact that, judicial activism, basically what Sandra Day O'Connor said, they're not the problem. You guys are the problem because you guys now are setting up a situation where not only the independence of the judiciary is under attack, but you could have an issue of judges themselves being under attack, physical violence. Incredible statement.
Julianne?
Sandra Day O'Connor, although clearly a conservative Republican, has always shown herself to be someone who had basic common sense. You saw that in some of her Supreme Court decisions where she attempted to balance this and that. And I think what she's saying here is that her party has gone too far. We have seen judicial violence. We've seen judges executed because of extreme rhetoric. We have seen Tom DeLay talking about judges being accountable in the Terry Schiavo case. And so her comments really are a chiding that people need to pay attention to. But Ed, I think that we keep hearing about the liberal bias in media. I think the way this statement has been buried makes it clear that there is no liberal bias. Indeed, there is a conservative bias. This is something that really ought to have garnered headlines, especially in the current climate. And the fact that it did not really does speak to the suppression and censorship that seem to be part and parcel of being Republican these days.
Either that, Michael Myers, or a very lazy crop of journalists who, don't necessarily go beyond just the wires. We should note that Chicago newspaper and NPR did first break this story. Go ahead.
Well, not only that, we also understand that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has spoken up and has disclosed there's been death threats against Supreme Court justices. This is a very strong statement. We should avoid these ends by avoiding these beginnings. I can't improve upon the statement. I can only say amen. But I would say this as well. This is not a liberal court. I mean, to suggest that this is a liberal court is itself Orwellian. It is more liberal than some of the right wing want it to be. But the last liberal court that I remember was the Warren Court. And it's the Warren Court that came under a great amount of a national attack. It was Warren where we had the bumper stickers that said impeach Earl Warren because of the Brown v. Board of Education school desegregation decision. Don't forget, historically speaking, in context, that Nixon challenged the court as well. Nixon said that he was not going to obey anything other than a definitive ruling from the United States Supreme Court in U.S. v. Nixon. It just happened to be 8-0, so it was definitive. But there was a possibility that Nixon was not going to obey the United States Supreme Court. Beginning in the nation, you had Chief Justice John Marshall and Jefferson saying, I won't obey the court. I'm going to obey you. And so you have Marbury versus Madison. So you've had a very long tradition in this country of the judiciary being under attack and trying to assert its independence. And I'm in favor of the independent judiciary, but I'm also in favor of a very liberal Supreme Court, which we do not have.
I think the difference here, though, is that you have members of Congress who are positioning the American public against the courts, basically telling the American public that the courts, and using religion as sort of the overtone, basically saying they're not only betraying the country, they're betraying our Judeo-Christian heritage with some of these rulings, and therefore they're not legitimate, and therefore it's okay if we take out some of these judges because we're doing it in a very moral, righteous way.
Yeah, because it's very different to have what some would consider a rogue presidential romp against the court on one particular issue versus a wave of political movement to try to push
But they've
the court.
accused the court justices of being communists. William O.
They
Douglas,
have, but I think
Earl
what we saw in the Terry Schiavo case, for instance, the fact that you would have members of Congress attempt to manipulate a court in that way was very scary. And I think what's
not
going
only
on,
not only the court, but also the Congress, but also the president. I mean, what you have here is a zero tolerance for dissent. And absolutely zero tolerance for dissent. Even when you have appointed the court members, the way that they've turned on Kennedy and Souter, who are, as Michael Myers correctly points out, these are not liberals. I mean, this rhetoric takes you to the limit of what FDR attempted to do when he tried to do court packing, to expand the court and to pack it with his own members. They've not quite gone that far, but they skirt on this with a kind of rhetoric that suggests that a justice supposedly selected because of their judicial acumen, passed on by the American Bar Association, vetted before whatever, and all this vetting, of course, never gets black folks or women quite through, but, vetted for all this, and then when they don't agree with you 100%, suddenly they become the devil.
All right, let me make a quick correction. I said a Chicago Daily newspaper. It was a Chicago Daily Law Bulletin that helped break this story. Let us move on to what to some see is a very frightening story, though perhaps not surprising. The El Paso, Texas FBI office has been focusing on gang activity in the United States Army. U.S. soldiers are affiliated with one of the most violent gangs in the country, the office says, the Folk Nation Gang. And what this gang does is they take a look at people, young people interested in joining their organization. Then they encourage them to join the military. And then through the military, they hope that they will gain access to weapons, explosives, and basically try to filter them back onto the streets. Michael Myers, when you see that this is going on, when you hear about this, what's your thought?
I've heard about this for years. This is nothing new. This is not news. I can tell you that gang activity is inconsistent with military service, and the military commanders know that, and they have education programs, and they have investigatory programs going on to root it out, to find out what these gangs are. The beautiful thing about military service is that your loyalty has got to be to your fellow troops, regardless of your skin color, regardless of the quote-unquote tattoos they may wear, or you may wear. And it's the military that says your loyalty must be to your fellow soldier and to the United States. Gangs do not work in the military.
Though we find often, Walter feels that is the truth on the battlefield, but not necessarily in the barracks.
And I'm not so sure it's always the truth on the battlefield. I mean, part of, what we're up against, we have to remember, look at the history behind Tim McVeigh and his involvement with white supremacist groups. About 10 years ago, you had two black members of the Army who were killed in North Carolina on the street. I mean, I think there's a real problem with infiltration of the military by some of these elements outside of the military. And the real challenge is, how do you screen that out? Because anyone could pretty much pass muster and say, oh, I'm not involved, but you'd never know. The U.S. government is going to have to devise some sort of rigid screen, even after you've inducted someone in a service, to make sure that those ties do not exist. Because it is a problem if you have individuals who, number one, have access to weapons, but number two, are being trained in their use. And then that becomes exported out to these gangs or to white supremacist organizations. Then you've got a real problem on your hand.
We should note also, Julianne Malveaux, but about a month and a half ago, we had a story about an African-American FBI agent who had infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan and found out, obviously doing most of it via phone, and then having an operative, a white colleague, go in for meetings in dealing with the military out west, and finding that many of these people who were card-carrying Klan members were not only in the military, but in highly sensitive areas of the military.
Again, as Michael Myers said, what's new? I mean, actually, if the Klan was only able to exist as long as it did and as hard as it did because of their relationship with existing both military and non-military institutions in the United States. What strikes me here as I listen to Walter Fields talk about rigid screening is what kind of rigid screening can we afford at a time when the military can't attract enough people anyway? When for the first time, this year and late last year, the Army was unable to meet its recruiting targets. I mean, we've set ourselves up for all kind of folk being in there. They've been in there all along, but I think we've set ourselves up for even more by the fact that we're in a war that is widely opposed by many people. We have an economic situation. If you read the economic report of the president, they tell you we're going to have a booming economy until 2011. But if you go into the hood and some other places, people do not have that kind of optimism. So we're in a situation where you have both cost push and demand pull, people getting into the military because they're not opportunities, but also the military needing all kind of people, not able to do the rigid screening because they can't meet target in a war that is extremely unpopular.
All right, let me turn our attention to something that we've been following and have been talking about over the course of the last month or so. In particular, as many of you know, every first Monday on this program, we talk with Bruce Gordon of the NAACP and Mark Morial. One of the things we talked to on their last visit was whether or not they believe that the upcoming New Orleans mayoral election would be just. Take a listen to what Bruce Gordon had to say and his push this week. We'll get into that. Let's take a listen.
It is now time for the Attorney General to weigh in through Section 5 of the Voter Rights Act. And the question is going to really be, is he willing to demonstrate the courage and the conviction of what he has expressed in previous meetings and take the actions that provide satellite voting locations for displaced New Orleans residents so that ultimately evacuees are given the opportunity to participate in the electoral process.
Michael Myers, the NAACP, is now this week really stepping up their push and urging the Justice Department to block the New Orleans mayoral election. Bruce Gordon furthering the comment that he believes that they cannot conduct and guarantee and provide some level of assurance of a fair and just election.
I don't know what fair and just is in these circumstances and contexts. I have to disagree with the NAACP and go with the federal judge. Federal judge says it's time for the election. You've already postponed it from February. April's plenty enough time. For me, the issue is enough polling places, absentee ballots, the logistics of getting an election. And even in New York City, where we had the aftermath of 9/11, people are trying to change the election.
But you say that those are the questions for you, but if you have so many people still displaced and you don't have what Mark or what Bruce is suggesting, that satellite polling, that many of the people don't even necessarily know the new dates and all of that, how do you rectify that?
You have a disputing of the facts, and you have people who are saying we do have enough polls, we have super polling places, we have absentee ballots, there are procedures for mail-in ballots, there's TV advertising for people who are not in New Orleans anymore. I think the real issue for the NAACP, which has become a racially grievance organization as opposed to an organization for the advancement of colored people. Their issue is that this is New Orleans, it's a chocolate city, there's a specter and a possibility that there might be a white mayor after so many years of having a black mayor.
Michael Myers, I think you go too far.
I don't necessarily think that's the issue. I think Mike has raised...
All right, hang on one at a time.
I think
Walter, go ahead.
Mike has raised some important issues in terms of the mechanics and infrastructure of elections, and I think that's why it's important to have the Justice Department under the Voting Rights Act weigh in on this, because I think if you don't have the right mechanisms and the right infrastructures, you can't have a fair election. I was very concerned when I learned that they didn't have any accommodations for voting outside of the city of New Orleans in places where there are large numbers of evacuees. How can you have an election when a large percent of your populace is not going to be able to get to a polling place to vote? I mean, I think that there's a real question here of whether or not you're going to have a sham election. There's no need to have an election just to say you had an election. The election should be about something. It shouldn't be about a date on a calendar.
All
right, Julianne, go ahead.
Let's just deal, there's some numbers that I think we need to deal with. New Orleans had a population of nearly 500,000 before the hurricane hit, before Katrina hit. Now it has a population of nearly 200,000. Before Katrina hit, it was 67% black. Now it's something like 20% black. This is not just about market forces. I mean, gentrification and some things happen because of market forces. This is about deliberate action on the part of the federal government. FEMA will not share the addresses of evacuees so that they can be notified. The mail ballot process is cumbersome. Someone has to write for a ballot and then have it come back. It's a very cumbersome process that will, on the cusp, have perhaps tens of thousands of people disenfranchised not because they didn't make the request on time, but because the Secretary of State does not have the personnel to process this stuff rapidly. So I think that Bruce Gordon is right on. I was laughing earlier because Michael Myers never fails to just basically confirm, the fact that he is a reprobate or something else. I mean, when he starts talking about, you're quoting.
Well, but let's be sure.
He's putting Ray Nagin's words in Bruce Gordon's mouth, and that's wrong.
All right,
Ray Nagin was the one who said Chocolate City, but what Bruce Gordon said is Title V, just Title V, just voting rights. Let's be clear about that.
Let's be clear about one other thing, Julianne Malveaux, and that's this fact. We know for sure that whether FEMA gives out the addresses, FEMA, the federal government, the local government, frankly, doesn't know where at least half, if not 3/4 of these evacuees currently stay.
Some of them are, Ed. They know
that's why I said, but at least half, they don't know.
Notify those people? Can they do ads in Houston? Can they do ads in Atlanta? Can they do ads in Detroit?
Yes.
We know these people all over the country. Can they take an ad out on BET or TV1 or wherever folks are going to be? And it's not just African Americans we're talking about.
Right.
We're talking about white
there's no
folks
doubt
who are
about
able
that.
to vote as well. ABC,
And we should note that they have done some of that.
And I can
Very
say
little.
there is a possibility for advertising. There's a possibility for voting. There is an encouragement of voting, and that's what the NAACP should be doing. They should be encouraging people to vote.
Well,
and the NAACP
timeline, Michael. Come on,
I think it goes beyond. It goes beyond encouraging people to vote. It's the sanctity of the structure of an election, and right now it's a mess in New Orleans.
I say Bruce
and
Gordon
I think
should
that
put
the
some,
NAACP has a point
I say
here.
Bruce Gordon should put some chaplains in the prison, so we don't have to have government paying for chaplains.
All right, now I suspect.
What does that have to do with voting, Michael
Look,
Myers?
Julianne, don't go there. Don't go.